So what do you think about the SEC thing? Like, how do you think that's going to play out?
First court date's November. It always takes a while. The XRP case took 2.5 years for them to finally settle. If they decide to settle out of court, they could do it sooner, I think, because that was like they took it all the way to the bitter end with XRP. They really fought it out.
Oh, yeah.
Because they wanted to prove it, they wanted to be a precedent. But yeah, with Richard Hart, I think this is what it boils down to. Number one, SEC is civil enforcement, not a criminal enforcement. They haven't charged him with anything criminal yet. They're coming after him with allegations of misappropriation of funds and all this and that, but he can easily prove that that's not true. It was his own money. He didn't commingle the funds. As long as he wasn't taking money from the crypto and putting it into his bank account and then spending that, it's fine. He's already had the money before. Now, I pretty much can assume that he wasn't doing that, but you never know. Maybe that's the case. They're going to try to charge him with something like wire fraud or whatever, but that hasn't happened yet. Point is, it's civil enforcement. What typically happens, they charge you with a fine, you pay the fine, you move on with your life. Look at what happened with EOS. They had a record raise. They paid a slap on the wrist and they walked away with billions of dollars. What's wrong with that? They paid like a $25 million fine or something stupid, and they made like $2 billion. So Richard Hart can pretty much do whatever he wants at this point. Nothing's really they can't touch him. And even if they did, what the worst that's going to happen is he's going to spend a little bit of time in jail for some fabricated charges in the future. And that doesn't really affect us because he has no validator nodes. He doesn't physically have any money in Pulsechain that we know of that he's going to do anything with. He's already said, he's pretty much hands off. It's like, hey, take over, guys. We're the community. We are Pulse, not Richard Hart. Richard Hart helped create it. Yes, he's the creator. But just like how God created humans, it's up to you to live your life. You don't look up at him and say, okay, what do you do now? Feed me. Tell me what to do next. Yeah. No, you feed yourself and you do what you need to do. You live an autonomous life and you find your own meaning. And that's what we have to do is we have to find our own meaning in this chain and build our own value. Don't expect others to, like you said, don't ever expect to profit from the work of others. So we're all looking at him as if he's going to have the answer when it's like, dude, he created the product and the tool, go use the tool. If you have a hammer, go use it. Don't look at the Home Depot and ask them how to use a hammer. But people are stupid. They want to be spoon-fed the information. They want to be spoon-fed the money. They want to be spoon-fed, and then they want you to chew it up before you spoon-feed them, and it's like you're a bird. It's ridiculous, man.
Yeah. Basically, Richard said that you either, is it founders or holders usually do the best? And so that's really all you can go for right now is if you're a founder or you're a holder, if you hold long enough, maybe the price comes down on your side.
I think liquid loans is going to be a major catalyst as well. That's something that we have to consider is liquid loans is coming out. They've got the Oracle, Fetch Oracle. They've got a few other things like Power City and things that are kind of waiting on this launch. But, projects are waiting for this to happen, and it's going to help lock more liquidity on chain, which is very important. We need more TVL. We need more platforms. There's just not enough. And everything that's come up so far has just been yield farms, which have been decimated. All of their TVL has been wiped out by the farmers, or then just moved to the next thing. So it's just been like a mercenary liquidity problem over and over. And it's silly because people don't see this. They don't understand how this is a failed tokenomic structure that's been repeated over and over and over, which is the mercenary LP problem. You create this token, you reward people with the token, like a cake token type thing where they had, Chirp Finance, Daytona Finance, Easy Swap, YieldX, all these different tokens, right? They're all the same thing. You provide liquidity, you earn it, they dump it, they move on. Once the yields go down, they move.
With the SEC, which they did, CFTC and DOJ came pretty much together for Arthur Hayes and Martin Shkreli. They did it separately in other cases, but there were much smaller cases. I personally don't think Pulsechain is criminal charges just because of, sacrifice political statement and in writing. It literally says that. So a jury of 12, I don't think will decide that. But they did bring fraud. But I just don't think they're going to get criminal charges on that. I think it's the manipulation. And whether or not they can prove it, what's the KYC, where, Kraken or wherever else, there was off-ramp too. That's what the case hinges on, the manipulation side of it.
I would just be interested to know if they're going all the way back that far, if any of the original devs came forward, or if they have any communication or things like that, if they need addresses versus actual threads where Richard's talking about doing these things.
What do you mean addresses?
Can they prove that fraud based on chats versus actual addresses?
Blockchain addresses.
yeah, like if Richard instructed these devs to do that, or said, wouldn't it be cool if we sat there and did this? I mean, I'd like to know more of why these devs stepped down or went, undercover. And we don't see anything about these names anymore. And if any of these guys are potential whistleblowers. If they have a whistleblower, then like it might be easier to prove that fraud versus just needing, a KYC from an address.
Yeah, but like if someone accuses you of murder and you don't have any like direct evidence of that, like you need more. So yeah, that would be very interesting to see. Is there an accuser? So that's another one that we've uncovered in this Twitter Spaces from the original team. Step down. You can step down for many reasons.
I mean, I just feel like it's unlikely. It's more tied to like the 30% that you get.
30%. Can you expand on that?
Like as far as like conviction, like if something leads to over $1 million, you get 30% of that.
Whistleblowing? Are you talking about?
Yeah, I mean, not directly whistleblowing, no. If you have something that leads to a case and that case is resolved for, something over $1 million, you get 30%. It doesn't matter if you're correlated or not.
Yeah, I think maybe you're referring to like contingency cases and like how that works. Yeah, it's generally like the fee is about 33%, but that's usually for like civil cases where like plaintiff suing a defendant, not necessarily the government. So
Is that not applied to the SEC?
I don't know. Government stuff is different. That's like whistleblowing.
No, I'm just like I'm pretty sure I read that somewhere where the SEC, if you do
Yeah,
come
it's
forward with
entirely
enough
possible.
evidence,
It's entirely possible, and there's a huge amount of money at stake here. So that's
right?
entirely
So,
possible.
but there's
And
no
we don't know.
ramifications. There's no ramifications if I provide you something and it's not true. Like they have to prove that.
Right. And, we won't see the government's evidence potentially until, 2024. Richard, from what I can tell, has still not been served, not declared as legal counsel. Yeah. So we still haven't really seen any evidence just yet. This was really, unbelievably informative, both for myself and everybody else. And I don't want to take credit for any of this. It's all to you guys. You guys are really killing it. It's just like an amazing example of just like an investigation of something people care about, just like coming together and doing it much quicker than what the government's doing and kind of, what everybody else, So thank you. On this case, I'm like very interested in it. We've extracted like a bunch more intelligence today. I'm going to kind of marinate on all of this and probably have some thoughts. I'll just post them to Twitter. I'm not really trying to build a Twitter following. I don't really care very much for that. I'm really just like putting my thoughts out in real time. So I'm probably going to do that this week based on everything we've done. Thanks for everybody for contributing. So just kind of concluding remarks, kind of where we're at now. So the SEC has sued Richard Hart, I believe in Texas. Richard Hart, according to the SEC, is not in America. From what I could tell, based on the documentation online, the court reporter, Richard Hart has not been formally served yet. And in the law, generally speaking, you have to be served in person, like essentially be put on notice that somebody is suing you. And it has to be a process server. Maybe you've heard of that or seen it in the movies. Has to hand you the complaint in person to essentially establish to the judge that this person is on notice. And if they don't respond within a certain period of time, they automatically lose. And that's kind of, in America, anybody could sue anybody. And this is why lawyers and people with money that use lawyers are so powerful, because anybody could sue anybody and write any amount of money in like the complaint that you're liable for. And if you don't respond to that complaint, you automatically lose. If you don't respond in, generally like 30 to 60 days, 90 days, you automatically lose. So that's why service is so important, proving service. So Richard Hart has not been served yet, hasn't declared his legal counsel. At the beginning of this Spaces, we talked about briefly how Richard Hart's been posting a bunch of his legal arguments online. It's really nice for the community. But what I really wanted to get into, what I really wanted to see from Richard was the on the hex manipulation claim. And to his point, it's not really a legal argument. That's more of like a factual argument. So there's two key claims. One, that the adoption amplifier, essentially token generation event of hex, was manipulated, and that the Ethereum that was put in was recycled. Over 90% of it was recycled. So that's one of the key arguments for the SEC. And that will depend entirely on the forensic blockchain investigation, essentially tracking money from moving from one wallet to another. Now, it might be very difficult to prove, given that zero knowledge proof mixers like Tornado Cash existed at the time and they were not illegal. So that's going to depend entirely on the government's blockchain investigation. And then the other charge that was also brought was for essentially the Pulsechain and Pulsex sacrifices, in which hundreds of millions of dollars were sent to Ethereum addresses, and those Ethereum addresses then received Pulse and Pulsex tokens. And whether or not that was securities fraud, because Richard they accuse of taking the money and spending the money on diamonds and Louis Vuitton bags. Now, the argument against that is that Richard, in writing in the Pulsechain and Pulsex terms of service, says that you have no expectations. He said that so many times. He said that these are for political statements. And then he also said on video many times, or definitely more than once, that he's doing this outrage behavior, spending the money on the diamonds and clothes to get more attention to these causes, political causes, freedom of speech, freedom of movement. And then also in the Pulsechain sacrifice, they donated $27 million to Longevity Sense Foundation. So he generated all this money and behaved this way as marketing for political statements and longevity, and that no expectations. So in my opinion, it's going to be very difficult for a jury in a criminal court to find Richard Hart guilty if in writing it says you have no expectations of what this money is going to be used for. Whereas in like ICOs that were, charged, they promise like a flying car and you'll make all this money. Maybe he said 10,000x in ROI, but he definitely qualified those statements talking about Ethereum. Not definitely. I'm sure maybe he slipped up. But he definitely did say that you have no expectations. And, it's in writing in these Pulse and Pulsex sacrifice terms of service. And that they were political statements. So I don't think, so the question really is, are criminal charges going to be brought? I personally don't think criminal charges will be brought on that matter, on the Pulsechain, because of all the defenses I just said. But at the same time, they did charge him with securities fraud. They did not charge Coinbase, XRP, Telegram, or EOS, with that matter, with fraud. And those are all cases that settled or with the SEC, or the SEC actually lost in the case of DCG and XRP recently.
What about Binance?
Binance, yeah, the word fraud in the Binance complaint is used more times than less times. It's used 10 or more times in the Binance complaint. Let's see. That's an important question. Richard Hart case, Binance case, Binance SEC complaint. In the SEC Binance complaint, they used the word fraud 17 times. In the Richard Hart case, they used the word fraud 10 times. In the XRP and Coinbase cases, I think they use it 2 times or less. But then specifically in the Richard Hart case, in the claims for relief, they specifically say fraud in connection with the purchase or sale of security, employed a device, scheme, or artifice to defraud, and then fraud in the offer or sale of security, which is different actually from the Binance case as well. So the question that we have, I guess, for our next space is we need to ask, or we need to find, the community needs to find, in times when the SEC has charged with fraud, how many times, this is our task for the next Twitter Spaces, how many times has the DOJ or a defendant been charged criminally for securities fraud when the SEC has charged that same defendant with securities fraud? That's kind of what we need to know. Based on the evidence, I don't think it's going to happen, but who knows? They put it here, and securities fraud is a felony, and the SEC is a federal body. And then to address Money Talk with Dane's other question, the other charge is manipulation of hex during the hex, they call adoption amplifier, also maybe known as token generation event. They said that over 90% of the transactions, Ethereum transactions, were recycled, which will depend entirely on the government's blockchain investigation and arguments there. So even, I think it'll be difficult to prove that, Richard did all that. But even if they are able, the blockchain investigation shows that he did do that, they'll be able to introduce evidence in criminal court, in civil court as well. But I think in civil court, it'll be much more difficult for Richard. Whereas on this matter, if it does show that, his KYC is tied to the manipulation. But in criminal court, think of the O.J. Simpson DNA case, where DNA was super new at the time, and they were able to throw a whole bunch of wrenches in there to get reasonable doubt, to get some members of the jury to not, 12-0 decide that O.J. was guilty. Blockchain forensics is relatively new. It's not 30 years old. It's not even 10 years old. And it's not open source. It's a black box. So if it's a black box, how do we know that you're coming to the right conclusion? So those are the kind of like the key elements of the case. And if criminal charges are brought, I do think the price of these coins will go much lower. If they're not brought, Richard will have to be served first for the case to really start. Then he'll have to declare his counsel. So we may be well into 2024 before we make any headway on this SEC case. So we have a task to do for the next spaces, whenever that is. So we have some drilling down. I'm going to marinate on this and probably be tweeting this week. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Really wonderful job. Awesome job by the entire community.